Origin of species. As we have learned from the previous chapter, microevolution happens when the allele frequency in their population change. Natural selection has a driving force that adapts the population to its environment. Mutation, natural or artificial selection, gene flow, and genetic drift are all able to cause microevolution. But we would never have different species, but only highly adapted versions of the original species with microevolution. This is now the time to talk about macroevolution, or about speciation, when one species split into two or more species. 3.5 billion years ago, when the first ancestral species gave rise to two or more species, and from those species other new species formed. Darwin thought that the entire relationship between species is like a tree. The trunk close to the ground would represent the first ancestral species, and as we go towards the crown of the tree, the branches would appear and more branches come off from previous branches. He concluded too that species that come from the same common ancestor share some characteristics with the most common ancestors. So in here, the M is sharing the same characteristic with X and Y. Darwin's brilliant vision of speciation explains both the diversity and the unity of life. However, before we move on, we have to pause for a moment and try to understand what species is. It's kind of a tree. And those are the orange is the common ancestor for the blue M dot and the green dot. Okay, so we can distinguish, how can we distinguish between two species? Are they the same? This flower and that butterfly. Well, you can tell that they are different species. That's easy. But how about the finches on the Galapagos Island, or the flycatcher birds? They are pretty much the same, or any differences? It's not that easy. They look almost alike. So what is really a species? So one way to define species is the biological species concept. Members of the species can potentially mate in nature, and they can produce fertile offspring. So far, so good. But can we say that the grizzly bear and the polar bear are in the same species? The grizzly and the polar bear? Because global climate change, the ice cap is melting over the Arctic area, and more polar bear is forced to live on land. The two bears can potentially mate and produce the growler. There are some limitations also for the biological species concept. How about the asexual reproduction? The second one is the other definition for species are the morphological species concept that relies on the physical characteristics of the species. The strength of the concept is that it does not have to deal with mating, but the weakness is it's very subjective. The third one is the ecological species concept, focuses more on the organism's ecological role in the environment, what they eat and where they live, like the mollusks in the tide zone and the mollusks in deeper in the shore. The phylogenetic species concept defines species as a small group of organisms. This will be the fourth, the phylogenetic species concept, based on common ancestor. Tracking back the common ancestor, scientists use DNA sequencing, morphology, and biochemical pathways in different organisms. The weakness of this explanation is how much the DNA sequence must be different to be considered a different species. In biology, we will use the biological species definition and focusing on the possibility of producing fertile offspring. The presence of any types of reproductive barrier prevents the gene flow between the organisms and keeps a reproductive isolation between the species. Usually the species keep their identity, but sometimes not. Sometimes they can produce offsprings, and the offsprings of two different species is called the hybrid. Hybridization is very common in plants, but not in animals. So let's check the different types of reproductive barriers that stops the gene flow between different species. The first type of barrier is the prezygotic barrier. So it stops gene flow, the reproductive barrier, the prezygotic barrier. This is really prevents species from mating. Examples for that is in different habitat of the species, so they do not have opportunity to meet and mate. Some of them live on the top of the tree, and some of them live at the bottom of the tree. Some species breed, so the timing is can be different. Breed at the beginning or the end of the spring. Behavioral differences also count as prezygotic barrier, how the organisms behave. The lack of intersexual selection excludes the mating between different species. Besides physical incompatibility of the reproductive parts, gametic incompatibility also prevents interspecies mating. The other type of barrier is the postzygotic barrier, although it allows different species to mate, but the produced offspring either reduced in its viability, or it will be sterile, like the mule, or the hybrid's offspring would be sterile, like different plants, in the case of different plants. And I think that's the end.